It's the dreaded direction we all seemingly struggle to understand. Conversational. My guest today is going to help us figure it out, bringing experience from directing over, get this, 125,000 auditions. Now, I suppose if you haven't mastered the art of conversational after that many, you're probably never going to figure it out. So I'm glad you are here with us, Hugh Klitzke. We need your help.
Hello, Mark Scott. How's it going?
It is going very well. You know, one of the things, and I got to say, I'm a little disappointed. One of the things that really impressed me about you was that you were a hat guy.
Yeah, I'm a hat guy.
And I was like, I hope he's wearing a hat when he comes on to the show today. I love that you're a hat guy. I have always wanted to be a hat guy. And I'm the guy that, you know, I'll be walking through the mall and I'll see a hat in a store, you know, and I'll try it on. And I'm like, I just look like a goof. I just cannot pull off the hat look. But you pull off the hat look and you look so stinking cool doing it. And I'm like, it's not even fair.
Not every hat is for everybody, but
That's true.
Is a hat. But there is a hat for everyone.
Mine is out there somewhere.
This melon head of mine, right, really only works in, unfortunately, hats that are really huge, and also then they tend to be more expensive, sadly, because they're so big. It's so big up here. It's not a general size, so
right.
It's like I gotta like live in like XL to double X, and that eliminates 95% of the hats out there in the universe.
I just keep holding on that I haven't found my hat yet, but at some point
you'll get there.
There's a few guys in the VO industry. Tom Antonellis is one that comes to mind, and I see you walking around with yours. Jim Frank, every once in a while I see him in one. I'm like, dang, I've always wanted to be able to be a hat guy. I think that's like, you know, channeling my inner Dick Tracy or something. I don't know, but
ooh, dating yourself there, but I love it. I love it. Warren Beatty, he could do a hat.
Yes, he can do a hat. Yeah, yes, and I cannot pull it off like him, and so to this point, I've not gone down that road.
Yeah.
So mankind has, I'm assuming, been speaking to each other since the dawn of language, which means, depending on the study that you cite, 70,000 years or so, which is when many believe that the first speech sounds were made. So with all this history of having conversations,
yeah,
why is it only in the last couple of years that every casting director on Earth has been telling us to be conversational? What the heck were we doing before that?
Well, when I started, you know, it was like, I'm old enough to have seen like a lot of really interesting changes just in all kinds of things, let alone in this industry that, you know, I've devoted, you know, X number of years to at this point. That's Queens, by the way. You know, I don't know if you can hear that, but that's Queens, New York in all its glory.
That is an
actual
Queens, little ambiance.
That's an actual street sweeper going by right there. That's what that is. And when I first got in, conversational this is the mid 2000s. It had really pretty much become de facto standard, but there was a certain resistance to it, for sure, for a lot of reasons. And it was mostly from talent, I think. But it really began to grab hold, I think, when advertising was taken over completely in the online space. Suddenly, the dialogue between the consumer and the folks that were putting content out to speak to the consumer had to get more fragmented, had to become more personal, had to become more specific. And nobody likes to be yelled at.
Right.
Right. So there was an amazing cartoon by a dude named, I think, Hugh McCloud or Hugh McSomething or other. He wrote a great book called Evil Plans. And his cartoon said, if you spoke to people the way advertising speaks to people, they'd punch you in the face. And I had that hanging up on my studio wall forever, right? And people, because it said copyright Hugh at the bottom, right? People thought it was something I came up with, but I had to constantly say, no, it's not mine. But right. I do really believe in that, right? Yep. Because it's like the marketer Seth Godin has said, people like us do things like this. You know Seth Godin's work?
I do, yep.
Okay, so that's one of his phrases, right? And when I thought about what goes on in that, it's like, these words are so specifically purpose written that those words have not changed all that much since print advertising really came into place, because they work.
Yep.
Because they can be read once or heard once, understood immediately and clearly with no takebacks. However, the way those ideas get presented is hence conversational, because nobody likes to be yelled at. Media changed, the landscape became a lot bigger, and yet interestingly more fragmented. So it began to become a dialogue between saying, hey, this is why I do this, right? And you're like me, so I think that you'd like to try this out too. And then in turn, that became part of the narrative. Now, the contrasting opinion on that is there's plenty of places where the announcer sound is absolutely valued, treasured, and nothing else will work. Why? Because there's a tremendous amount of tradition in media as well.
Mm-hmm.
So regionally, locally, with urgency around time, place, date, that says now, right now, only in this place, only at this time, requires the urgency of a more announcer sound.
It's interesting that you say that as media got bigger, it also got more segmented. And so I'm wondering if part of this is just the hyper targeting that takes place now.
Mm-hmm.
Once upon a time, you had ABC, NBC, CBS. You spoke to the entire country through one of three channels. And so whatever you were saying, it was going out to an audience, whether they were 3 years old or 90 years old. And now we've got a million different cable channels. We've got 10 million different radio stations. We've got 50 billion websites, and every one of them allows you to pick a very specific, very targeted, very niche audience. And so is there an element of, there's conversational when you're targeting Gen Z, and there's conversational when you're targeting millennial, there's conversational for the boomer, there's conversational for Gen X. And so is conversational more than one thing?
Yeah, sure. Because conversational is a read of interpretation rather than a read of presentation. So yeah, there's going to be the idea of what is the perspective of the narrator that's being cast for what particular reason. If you think about it, everybody needs to have a cell phone, right? The question then becomes, are you making the decision about that cell phone purely for yourself? Or are you making that decision about that cell phone for a group of people, like a family plan? So you're going to cast and read that same script to sell that same thing. And that script is going to be modified too, depending on what it is that's being talked about. But the values in that are going to be different. Values around the idea of, I want this phone because it's the latest and greatest thing, as opposed to, I want these phones because I need to make sure my kids are safe. That's what I mean when I say values.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So in turn, that interpretation of an idea, which isn't always explicit in the description of tone that they're asking for, the voice actor has in turn to interpret that based on ideas around casting, based on ideas around the direction or the tone that they're looking for, based on the content. So all of those decisions and the interpretation of all those decisions is a big part of conversation. So the long answer is, yeah, there are different kinds of conversational reads because it's an interpretation of all of these ideas.
So this is interesting, because when I see casting specs and I'm like, they put in, we're looking for a 20 to 35-year-old voice, or we're looking for a, must sound 55 or older or whatever.
Right.
And I'm always because they say it must sound, I'm thinking actual vocal sound. But really what it might just be is the difference between how a college student talks to another college student versus how a grandfather talks to a grandson type deal. And so the age gives you clues about the type of conversation. Is that accurate?
I think so.
Interesting.
I always go back to, my dad just turned 93. Okay. And I've audio recorded him, for different kinds of interviews. I also have an an audio recording of my grandfather, who in 1989, I audio recorded him when he was 84 years old.
Okay.
So the vocal qualities between my grandfather at 84 and my father at 93 are so vastly different.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather sounds like he's got every single year of his life in his voice. Now, he was a blue-collar worker. He had a one-man business. He ran an auto repair shop. He could remember when Henry Ford offered $5 a week for men to move to Detroit and work in his plant, and he told me stories about that.
Yep.
He was sucking up leaded fumes out of tailpipes in his garage for his entire work life. Mm-hmm. That took a toll on his body. That took a toll on his voice. That took a toll on his breath. He had, a cough, all of those kinds of things, and it took a toll on his speech. My dad at 93 doesn't sound anything at all like that, because, as my father has said, the heaviest thing I ever moved in my career was a piece of chalk across the chalkboard, because he was a high school science teacher.
Okay. Yep.
Right. So is it a miscast to use him, my dad at 93, for something when he sounds like he could be 20 years younger than my 85-year-old grandfather? No, because my dad is concerned, occupied with his grandchildren just as much as my grandfather was. So I think that the voice ages differently now than it has in the past, the same way our bodies age differently, the same way that our careers get longer, the same way we have different relationships with our families. So ideas around age aren't just numbers specifically. It's a shorthand. It's a good way to talk to voice talent and to talk about demographics. But also underlying that is, what is the spot? What do I care about in this spot as the narrator? As the narrator character, what do I have to think about in order to understand this script, in turn to make it sound natural, genuine, and real, despite the fact that it's so artificially written?
I think that's where so many of us, and I will say myself, I think that's where I get hung up, and is you're trying to achieve a sound, but it's really not about the sound of conversational. It's about the point of view of conversational.
I think so.
Interesting. Which is why you've got to take a minute, read the script, try to figure out, who am I speaking to, and determining that point of view more so than, they want me to sound 25, so I'll make my voice a little lighter or a little higher pitched or whatever. No, it's not that. It's, how does a 25-year-old talk to a 25-year-old?
100%.
Assuming they're talking to a 25-year-old, unless it's a 25-year-old talking to their mother, which is then a totally different type of conversation then.
100%. Yeah, right. You use the context clues in the script to also inform that notion of what is the character I'm supposed to inhabit. But then in turn, it's often not quite a one-to-one handshake.
Yeah.
Right. Where you do have to stretch your imagination, right? Hang out with me long enough and I'll inevitably go back to this fantastic online video on YouTube where Ian McKellen is talking in a Shakespeare workshop, and it jump cut right into him. 1979. I understand he still gives this workshop now. One student of mine actually saw him do it, and he says the words at the very beginning in 4 sentences, everything I want to say about voiceover. He says, I hope, if anything, this workshop has scotched the idea that Shakespeare's verse is music, and once you find the melody, everything will be all right. Rather, I believe that once you find the sense of the words, their sounds will look after themselves. He then proceeds to dissect the Tomorrow and Tomorrow monologue, but he also talks about all the things that are helping him interpret that monologue, which include conflict, character, direction, costuming, staging, lighting, sets, all of those things that he has to work with, as well as text. But the voice actor doesn't have any of those things to work with. We're barely even given context for the idea.
Yep.
So when we come to this notion around who am I, right? in this, or quote, who am I talking to? All that is a frame for the idea that you're providing a context to this, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, intensely unnatural, purpose written text that you are tasked with making it sound as genuine and approachable as real as possible based on all the stuff that's there on the page. But you got to lean in with your imagination to fill in what's not there. And that's what I focus on when I talk about the conversational read.
This brings up another good point then. In an ideal world, we are not in an online casting environment where it's a race to get the audition submitted first. And so we're not always taking the time that we need to take. So we've got some time. We've got a very clear script. We've got good direction from the casting director or the agent. We understand who we are, what our role is. We're able to identify all those things that would help us to deliver a perfect conversational read. But the reality is, more often than not, scripts aren't even written conversationally when they're asking for conversational, or we don't have all of those clues. So what are some tips that we can...
Dude, scripts are never written as conversations. All
right?
Ever.
They always ask
Ever.
for it.
Never.
And then I read it
Ever.
and I'm like, this is
Period.
the least conversational thing you can give me.
And they never have been, and they're never going to be, because like I said, these are purpose written words, and that's been perfected since 1880, practically. I found a great print ad from before the Civil War, and I'm looking at it and I'm just saying, a couple of tweaks, it sounds exactly like a modern commercial. What is it selling? A steam-powered device to drive in tent stakes for traveling circuses.
That'd be an interesting commercial.
And I'm like, boy, you can't get any more hyper-specific than that.
Yeah. Yep,
however, right. Imagine that, right? However, I'm reading it and going, triptychs, alliteration, where brand is here, recapitulation at the end, specificity in the middle. All of it is almost practically identical to what's going on. So all the comment around it's never written conversationally, it ain't never going to be written conversationally. Why? Nobody talks like that in real life.
So what do we do then when there aren't obvious clues? Like, we've all got that car commercial or that luxury brand that is written like an abstract art piece or something, like, like it doesn't mention the brand. It doesn't talk about what it's about. It's just written like some sort of abstract poetry. And they're asking you to deliver it conversational, and they don't tell you what the brand is because that's under NDA or whatever. And so you're sitting here looking at this thing and it's like, how in the world do you make that conversational? Are there tips or tricks that we can lean into that can help?
Sure. The first thing I would suggest is that you can impose a map upon practically anything, because if they're not written to serve a purpose, it's not going to serve that purpose, right? So it's usually very easy to find certain ideas of alliteration or certain ideas around the triptych or certain ideas to say, here is weighing one sound against another, or here's an idea that starts at the very beginning and then it reprises back at the end. And then in between, we've got all of these other ideas. There are ideas around line length. There are ideas around certain notions that seem to be pointing towards specific ideas, right? All of these things are ideas that I coach with more often than not. I give people maps in order to really understand what it is that you're looking for. But in general, and that's just a reaction to the script, in reaction to sound, because despite the fact that I'm saying, let the sound be a product of your work, yes, you do have to modify your sound at times too. That's prosody, right? To recognize that sometimes you have to allow your voice to settle down a little bit more in your body, that you don't have to project as much, for example. Or you also can recognize, hey, when I'm listening to myself back, the first thing I need to do is to try to take myself out of the equation as much as possible. So if I do 3 takes of something, right, you might want to listen to the third take first, then the second take, and then the first take.
Interesting.
If you do listen to yourself back, which you should, everybody does. We spend just as much time listening to ourselves as we do recording, right? When you record pre-life, don't listen to it on your playback, because your perception of your pre-life will inform your perception of the script material as well. So allow yourself to do 3 takes to do your pre-life, then begin your playback with only the script material, and then close your eyes when you're listening to it. Get yourself away from the script as you're listening to yourself back, so you can allow yourself to really understand, what did I do?
Right.
And then you can say to yourself, oh, I hear this one thing. Then go in and begin to build from one thought that you have for yourself. Oh, I hit that word too much. Great. Stop. Maybe go back and do the take again immediately. Building on that idea of, all right, now that I understand I did that, I'm going to step back and not hit that, and now see where this takes me. That's like a half a dozen things right there, without me having a script to actually, look at that way. But those are just in the ideas around listening and understanding what you did first without judging it.
It's interesting to hear you talk about, getting to that third take. Generally speaking, the advice is that the more takes that you get in to a script, the further you get away from it, because you start to get comfortable, or you start to know the script, and so you're not thinking about it the same way. And so, very often it's like, oh, your first or second take is always going to be your best take. By the time you're at the 10th or 20th, they all sound the same or whatever. But it almost sounds like what you're saying is, when you have the chance to connect with the script like that, maybe by the 6th take, you're actually having more of a conversation with it than the first take, where you were still reading it and trying to get comfortable.
I agree with that.
Interesting.
I agree with that. I think there can be a spontaneity to the first and second take.
Sure.
My experience shows me, though, that, like you just said, when you get into like around the 6th is probably where the sweet spot is. And so you can build out from the success of your third take, and then start to critique yourself at your third take, and allow your 4th, your 5th, and your 6th to build from the success of the third take. Because at its core, the more you do something, the better you get. Probably. The first take often has a spontaneity to it, but you may not really be entirely comfortable with it. You may not be able to have really internalized and understood the ideas to the point where you can inhabit them.
That's interesting, because that does go against a lot of what is the conventional wisdom, is, just, and I think part of that comes from this pay to pay mentality, where it's a race, right? It's a race to get the job finished. You don't have time to record 5 takes. You got to get it done, because if you don't get it submitted in the first 5 minutes, it's already too late or whatever. How does this translate to A/B takes? Right? If you get a script from your agent, they say, give us 1, give us 2, give us 3 takes, and you're trying to come up with some different takes, but they've all got to be conversational. Mm-hmm. Is it changing your character, changing your point of view? Where are you coming up with take 2 and take 3?
I used to say that if you've made a series of strong choices, there would be enough subtlety in multiple takes that you would be fine, right? But now I'm starting to trend a little bit more that once you make a series of strong choices, then in turn you can adjust. That the character that you're inhabiting, I don't think you really have to go so far as to create a whole new character for every individual team.
Okay.
Unless that's something that you're all about, right? And then rock on with it, Yep. Again, this is super duper. We haven't even discussed this yet, that the work itself is so individually personal, right? Everybody has to find their own way into it.
Sure. Makes sense.
All right. That's what I spend a lot of my time, working with folks about, in order to really find the things that make the most sense to them, based on their gifts, based on their experiences, all of those kinds of things. That being said, one really quick and dirty way to get multiple takes is to bump in with a different conjunction. I'm not voiceover talent, right? So, forgive me, right? The 3 basic stages in your dog's life are filled with specific needs. It's pretty standard, right?
Okay.
So you can begin with So the three basic stages in your dog's life. But the three basic stages of your dog's life and the three basic stages of your dog's life. So that's like instant,
three totally different vibes.
Right.
Start out the spot totally different way.
Yeah, all from just using the 7 standard, the only 7, I think, conjunctions in the English language. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Right? All of those 7 you can use to get into the beginning of a script in a completely different way. And then you can get really slick about it, where if you're in dialogue with your imaginary best friend, right? We can talk about that for sure. Then you can push against that dialogue with a conjunction, right? I know you buy that cheap food for your dog, but as your dog's needs change, as opposed to, I know you buy this for your dog, and as your dog's needs change, it's a completely different dynamic because the energy shifts away from because sometimes pre-life is an on-ramp, and I think sometimes pre-life should be like a turn. So the conjunction can facilitate either one of those things. Again, so creating the dynamism of the context that you have to add that's not on the page.
So this is part of it, is getting in the booth and not just starting with the script, but starting with that lead in pre-life, as you said, and using that to help you find your direction, tone, conversation. Sounds like a big part of it. And changing that up, one word before you start can totally change the context.
You're using the context in a different way. You're not actually changing. It's actually a process of addition.
It's coming from a different perspective, I guess.
You're altering the perspective slightly, right?
So I believe that a lot of what goes on in the booth happens up here, right? It's psychological. It's
Agreed.
Where we're at, our state of mind, all that sort of stuff. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, because of the fact that every single direction now comes in and we see a conversational non-announcer, and usually non-announcer is written in like big, bold, giant capital letters. Is it possible that actually has gotten us in our heads? Because now we're thinking about being conversational, thinking about not being announcer. And while we're thinking about trying to do those two things, we're not actually just delivering the read because we're up in our head now. Do you think that all this direction has led to that? Would it be easier if we just assumed that everything was conversational and approached it that way and just...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. At its core, I don't understand why that isn't a given.
It feels like it should be, like you could save yourself a lot of time.
I think so. I think so. And yet it's constantly still said, right? And I just think it's a reaction to say, we don't want you to sound like what everybody thinks a commercial is. For some reason, we all have this version of the commercial sound in our imagination, right? We've never really been able to get away from it, no matter how many decades, how many generations have we not been voicing commercials this way, right? This has gone on for 45 years or more. Some folks say that the conversational read really took hold with the Ronald Reagan ad, "It's Morning in America."
Yeah.
And at a point, they actually called that the Riney read, I understand, after Hal Riney, who had written that spot, produced that spot, and he wound up voicing that spot as well. He didn't do very many voiceovers, that he had written and produced the spots for, but he did that one, the follow-up for that, and then there was like one other campaign that he had done. And I think there was a specific set of circumstances as to why they did it. But back in the day, when that became the rage, they began to call it the Riney read. Then it was a part of the landscape, and then it began to creep in more and more to all of these different kinds of things. And it became a big part of the narrative. Not all of the narrative, obviously, because yell at kids in certain kinds of commercials. They still yell at you on the radio,
Yep.
for Sunday, Sunday, Sunday,
Yep.
They still yell at you for, to come to, the Auto Mart for the big sale this weekend. But I have theories as insofar as why that read works for those ideas.
Oh man. I think what's interesting to me, and maybe because I've been in the business a little bit longer, so I've seen this. For anybody that's coming in, you come in the last year or two and everything is conversational non-announcer. Well, everything that I have seen for the last decade has been conversational non-announcer. So they're all giving us, for 10 years or more, they've been giving us this exact same direction. And yet the spots from 10 or 15 years ago don't sound like the spots today. Like the read, the conversational non-announcer read from 10 years ago is not the conversational non-announcer read from today. And I think that's maybe where some of us that have been in the industry a little bit longer, that's where we start to get confused, because maybe 10 years ago, you found the conversational non-announcer sweet spot and you booked a lot of work and you made a lot of money, and you found this groove that you got into, you did your thing. But now today, they're still giving you that exact same direction, but doing the same thing that you did that booked it all those years before. It's not working anymore. And now you're like, well, then what the heck is conversational non-announcer?
I agree. There were various efforts to take the word conversational and to put all these synonyms on it, right? Where it became, there was conversational, and then for a while it was called, we don't want it to sound like a voiceover. Then it became, we want it to sound real. Then it became, we want it to sound genuine. Then it became, we want it to sound like just a person off the street. Mm-hmm. All of those things. And I think that was part of the drift away from what you just said very correctly, that conversational 10 years ago would now almost be considered like an announcer.
I was going to say, that now they're telling you that it's an announcer.
Right. I agree. And I'm thinking back to the most successful voice talent I knew 10 years ago. And that read would be considered announcery now, where it was really about phrasing to sound. Now, so much of it is about subtlety. And I think in large part, that's because the places where people are advertised to has changed now. 10 years ago, podcasting didn't really exist. Not quite, certainly not the way that it did now. Does now,
sure.
For sure, right? That really began to jump to the fore like around, let's say, 5 years ago. Really the podcast networks and everything really started to take off just before the pandemic. So a podcast audience is an audience of one. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why the NPR space, repurposing those shows into the podcast format, they were the ones that began to have the first success. Why? Because that kind of announcer in that kind of context was extremely low key, to the point where regular broadcast kind of looked down on it as being boring. But they kept doing that. Then when the podcast audience became the discretionary audience of one, that you would choose to listen to that rather than dialing into something and taking what was thrown at you, suddenly that particular audience and individuals began to recognize, hey, I'm choosing to be here. I want to be spoken to in a different way. Right. And think about it. The premium that advertisers are willing to pay for the podcast host to read the ad is more than for them to hire a different voice to read it. Why? Because they're a part of the narrative. Again, you're dialing in to hear whoever talk about their thing, whatever it is. And in turn, you're tuning in to hear Andrew Huberman talk about his thing. So therefore, you're going to pay more attention to Andrew Huberman talking about athletic greens, for example, than another voice talking about it, because he's a portion of the narrative, a portion of the dialogue. And Andrew, I don't know if he reads commercials fairly well. Some podcast hosts don't, and they should talk to me about that, frankly. But anyway.
I've listened to a few of those. I'll give them your number.
They're bad at it, And I'm just like, dude, you really can do better. You really can. But all that aside, the NPR audience was used to being spoken to in a certain way. When that moved into the podcast space, Suddenly, the dialogue of one-to-one happened. All of broadcast had to change because suddenly the audience was even smaller than before. It wasn't just sports fans now on Sunday, right? Getting X number of million. It wasn't just, oh, I'm home from work, I want to see my sitcom. And it wasn't just, I'm doing the drive time, in Boston, right? To hear the morning drive time. It became even smaller. And as it became smaller, it required a different kind of delivery, a communication of one person to one person.
So as technology, AI, gives advertisers the ability to be even more hyper focused on very small, very specific, very targeted niche audiences,
Okay.
this only becomes more prominent and more relevant as far as being able to deliver conversational to that person, to that, that audience of one. So I almost think from a casting perspective, right now they're giving us, we're looking for a male that sounds 35 to 45, conversational non-announcer. And what I really want to see in the directions is this is the audience that you're going to be speaking to. Because then I could frame it totally or then I think then I would be able to frame it totally differently, because it'd be like, okay, I'm being conversational to, this audience or whatever.
This audience, or the context of the idea, to have that expressed more, to say, maybe certain descriptions around the visual.
See, that's where I feel like part of this comes back to, voice actors are spending so much time trying to coach and train and get better at the conversational read, because that's what everybody wants: conversational, genuine, authentic, etc. There's a part of me that feels like casting directors should have to sit through a workshop to write better direction for the voice actors to help us achieve the conversational that we're looking for, because it's such a blanket term that ask 100 voice actors to submit a conversational read, and you're going to get 100 different interpretations based on, maybe it's based on their age, based on their frame of reference, based on their point of view, whatever. And so really what we need, partly anyway, are better specs direction to help us understand who we're talking. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I agree.
Can you work on that?
Sure. I would do that in a hot second. In a hot second, I would sit down. I actually have thought about that.
That's a workshop that needs to be taught.
That would be a workshop that I would do in a hot second. I would sit there and I would just, lay out 50 pieces of copy with 50 real pieces of direction and say, okay, here's why this works. And then in turn say, okay, here's why these don't work. Okay. And then it's like, all right, now how do you make this better? Right? How do you make this better in order to communicate your ideas more effectively?
It feels to me like, from a casting director's standpoint, it would actually save them a crap ton of time.
Yes.
Because half of their life right now is spent listening to reads that don't even remotely come close to the specs that they're looking for.
Yes.
But they don't come close to the specs they're looking for because they didn't really give good enough or clear enough direction on how to get to what they're looking for. So if they knew how to do that better, did that more effectively, they would get there a lot faster, probably get a lot better auditions.
Correct. Absolutely.
Yep. Yes. You should definitely teach that class. I vote for that.
I would do that. I would do that in a minute. Because they're not really trained. They're trained in how to write copy. They're not necessarily trained in how to communicate, right? To sit there with somebody and say, this is, what we want and why we want it, right? When I was scoring film, I learned this from an interview I read with Danny Elfman. Danny would do two things. One, whenever he would play back the score for the first time, right, with the director there in the room, he would look at the director and pay attention to how they reacted. Because he knew at that moment that was the person that he had to please, and he needed to understand what resonated with the director more than anything.
Yeah.
For myself, when directors would ask me about putting tempo music in, right? Everybody knows what that is, right? Just music that they would put up against, their visual to edit to, or for whatever reasons, right? Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. some composers are like, oh, don't do that, don't confuse me or whatever. And there are famous stories of Bernard Herrmann like freaking out when he had even his own music put up against a film, right? And he would just squeal and say, how do you expect me to think of anything else when you've already put up my music against something? I always loved it, right? because I would sit there and I would look at the director and I would say, okay, great. Tell me what you liked about that. Tell me what you liked about that music.
Yeah.
And inevitably, I was wrong. Whatever reason I thought they might have chosen to put that music up against that thing, right? I was always wrong, because it might be about the rhythm. It might be about the orchestration. It might be about that particular instrument. It might be about the way something landed with something, right? And I was always wrong. But once I understood what they liked, then in turn, that gave me something to build off of. But they never actually said it, right? I actually had to ask the question, right? So in the voiceover universe, right, if they give you an archetype, let's say they give you, let's use James Earl Jones,
Okay.
now that he's, gone back to the ancestors, right?
Yep.
What is it about JEJ that you like, right? Mark, you could list all the great things about James Earl Jones, right? All of them. But there would be at least a half a dozen different adjectives that you would use. List a half a dozen adjectives you think of when you think about James Earl Jones's voice and his performance. Go for it.
Deep, authoritative,
Okay.
wise.
Okay.
I think calming and soothing, depending on
Calming,
the context sometimes,
soothing,
right?
right? Yeah.
And forceful.
Forceful. Yeah. Storyteller.
Yeah.
Right. A gentleman of a certain age.
Yeah.
A timeless quality.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay. So any of those reasons could be the first reason why somebody would choose him as an archetype.
Right.
So I would love to see, in writing direction, right? If there's somebody that you like, for example, then in turn talk about why you like them. What is it about them?
There's a big difference between
you?
James Earl Jones, forceful and authoritative, and James Earl Jones, calm and soothing.
Yes.
And if you just tell me the voice we're thinking about is James Earl Jones, but you don't tell me whether you're thinking about forceful James Earl Jones or soothing James Earl Jones, how the heck am I supposed to know? Right? Yeah.
I ran this great experiment on LinkedIn. It was just like by accident. I had put up these different brands and I had said about little stories about them for myself, about what resonated with me about them. Like I put up Coca-Cola, and I talked about my aunt and uncle in Michigan, giving it to me at Christmas. And I put up Apple Computer, and I talked about my big brother in the 80s getting the Apple Computer, that way. And I talked about Comstock cherry pie filling. And I talked about my sister making no-bake cheese pie at every holiday because she knows I love it, right? And then I asked the question, what do you like about different brands? And folks began to chime in. And then I was reading each of them, and I said, wait, and I began to just excerpt from each of their responses, their feelings, their emotions. And then I just pasted it underneath and began to realize, hey, that almost seems like direction, where it's like this particular thing they like, right? Toyota, let's say, gives them security or confidence, or the damn thing's not going to break.
Yeah.
Right? Things like that. Or one really sweet story was about a particular comforter set that she would snuggle with at the time her fiance that later became her husband. And I'm like, that's really sweet, but then just pulling those emotions out in it, right? So it's really not that hard. You just kind of have to take that deeper step. And then in turn, that becomes something that a voice actor could relate to really, really specifically, to really understand it. Because it's not even so much what as it is why.
This is why the actor part of voice actor is becoming so much more key today. We're not in this rip and read world that we were in 20 years ago, where everything now is totally nuanced. Because we can hyper target to audiences, it gives you the ability to be much more intentional about who you're talking to and how you're speaking to them. And so this is why the actor side makes so much more of a difference. So obviously we can work with you, and I think you're making a very good case for why we would want to do that today. What are some other things that we can do? Is it just coaching, or do you suggest, like, take an acting class, go to do a theater workshop, try improv. Like, what kind of things do you think that we can do that would help us to find some of these places that we need to get into?
You can hang out with me, obviously, and there are lots of different ways to do that for sure.
Yep.
And I appreciate that was very kind of you to say, by the way. Thank you. I really appreciate that. An acting the right kind of acting workshop would not be a bad thing, right?
So what's the right kind of acting workshop?
That's a great
Because
question.
there's a lot of different options, right?
There's plenty of different options. The same way there's plenty of different options around coaching, which is why, I began to succeed when I niched down specifically, right? Also, I was getting requests for it where I would ask a voice actor, this is not an answer to your question, but I would ask them, what are you looking for in a coach? And I was very surprised at the number of people who said to me, exactly, I've never been able to land the conversational read. Can you help me with that? And that's when I began to really change the focus of what I was doing to being just that, hence conversationalvo.com. I think a workshop maybe around monologues wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. I think a workshop that maybe focused on contemporary monologues wouldn't be a bad idea. I think that a workshop that's focused on the idea of the specificity around building a character would not be a bad idea, where you would have to try to figure out ways to kind of come up with it from whole cloth. Again, back to what Ian McKellen said, he's got all of these ideas to work with beyond just the words, even though the word is first in the British training.
Yep.
I think that, an actor concentrating on all of the other things that aren't just the words to realize this is where the theater of the mind comes in, right? The idea of what is the imaginative quality that I can bring to something in order to, as you said, to be able to engage the acting side of voice acting. In order to make that go, that would be something to think about. And improv is interesting because well done improv, you learn how to be very compulsive and you learn how to commit. And when you learn how to commit to an idea, then you're willing to go for it. And 3/4 of the time, that's really from you and the way that you're reacting to something. So if you look at improv in the sense of perhaps dramatic improv or scene improv, rather than just funny improv,
right?
Because we usually equate improv with the funny.
Yep.
Right.
Comedy
and comedy and all that. Great.
Yep.
Great. Nothing wrong with it, but that's not all of it. If there was an improv around drama, that way, perhaps, I think that could be helpful. Again, you have to learn how to fill in what's not there. And you got to get over the fact that you're never going to get it, even. You have to lean in.
I had the opportunity to sit in on part of your session at VO Atlanta, and it was great. You're a really good director.
Thank you.
I have to say, I've been with coaches in the past who are like, make it more conversational. Okay, but what the crap does that mean? Like, you can't just tell me make it more conversational. And so you did a really good job of directing. So I was really intrigued when I was doing some research for this interview, and I saw about your open studio sessions. I thought, okay, this is like a chance to, watch, everybody talks about being the fly on the wall. That's literally, let's be a fly on the wall in one of your sessions. I'm assuming that's what it sounds like.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
So tell us about the open sessions, how that works, and whether somebody wants to watch one or, be be coached in one. How does that all work?
Do you want to know where it came from first, or do you want to know
let's do that, because I think that's an interesting story. I don't know of any other coach that's doing anything like that.
Okay, so my background is in music, and there are lots of traditions in music education. The private lesson, for example, is a big part of the music education tradition. Everybody has an idea around that. It's different than the acting tradition because the acting tradition often concentrates on groups and classes in a lot of ways, right? What the musician does is then takes the private lesson into the performance group that way. But there's also another tradition that I'd heard about and I saw in videos online where a master teacher would get up and begin to coach somebody, but they would do it in front of their assembled studio. What does that mean? There would be, a pupil at the piano. There would be the master teacher. And then all of the rest of the people that study that instrument would be sitting in the room at the same time, watching the master teacher coach that other student as if they were in a private lesson. This is a tradition that goes back to the turn of the 20th century. Other folks have adopted it, and a lot of conservatory programs have it. I never saw it in the conservatory that I went to because I was in the master's program, so it was a bit different what I was experiencing. But I remember looking at that and really being transfixed and really thinking, that's kind of amazing, right? And thinking about what an opportunity it would be pedagogically to really sit there and observe someone else solving problems, to really listen to somebody going deep into the work, which is a little different than in a lot of voiceover coaching, where you might hear in the course of 2 hours, 10 people or 12 people get coached or redirected or critiqued, which are completely different things, because critiquing is completely different from direction, which is completely different from coaching, right?
Yep. Okay.
Right. And so in turn, you got to even understand what point of view the person giving the seminar is talking from, right? Because at any moment, they could be doing any of those things or just one of them, right? And I know that in the course of, like you said correctly at VO Atlanta, in a situation like that, more often than not, I'm actually directing with some coaching in there. And of course, there's a hint of, the critique that goes on. But I was trying in that environment to make that, really be about directing to really address what was going on, but also to coach, to say, here's a technique.
Yep.
So I said to myself, all right, if you're intrigued by this particular pedagogical model of an open studio in the music conservatory world, can you bring that into voiceover? And I said, I don't know, maybe. And I thought a lot about it, about the iterations of how that could work. Then I began to realize, okay, we do it on Zoom. Cool. All right. Then it's like, all right. But what if then it was somebody actively being coached to really make everybody who was going to sign up to observe, but also the person in the hot seat, understand that this is going to be about showing and doing the work in front of a group of people, which means it will be imperfect, which means it will be messy, which means it will be intensely personal, in order to really try to illustrate those moments of growth that happen in the private session, and then hopefully to illuminate a group of people who would observe this process. And so I talked to some of my, students and some, my former students, and said, this is what I want to do, right? Mm-hmm. Are you willing to do it? And I was really surprised that they were willing to go for it, because they also recognize that they're hanging out, all of their imperfections are going to be really on display, and they're going to go.
Everybody's watching. Yeah.
Right. And everybody's watching. Yeah. And that when you're getting coached, it's not pretty, in the sense that there may not necessarily be the great payoff at the end, because I'm working with somebody on a script until we can get what we can out of it. And that's usually not to perfection. So then we get to a certain point with it, we stop, abandon it, next script. And then we work as far as we can with it, stop, abandon it, next script. And I've only had one, and it went great. And I have a total of 3 right now on the calendar, and they're all the tickets for those are all scooped up. It's a free event, right? It's a free event, right? So 100 seats each, all of those have been scooped up. But because it's gone over so well, I've actually decided to add 4 more between the end of October and December. Okay. So there's going to be a total of 7 running from September through December.
Okay.
And then we're already talking about potentially beginning it again January, like the second week of January, because the engagement has been very, very genuine. And as I've talked to people who attended, it's interesting to hear what they subjectively take from observing somebody else do the work.
Yeah, that's
I talked to
interesting.
one person and said, I could see myself in some of the things that Natasha was doing.
Mhm.
And somebody else said, I began to really understand that I'd never seen or thought about the turns in a script before in such a specific way. Or all of these different things. And I never really thought about it like a Rorschach test, where it's like you're bringing yourself to observing this thing, and everybody in those 100 people that are observing, each of them are getting different things out of it. And I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I'm excited that it has really succeeded and it's being taken too well. And you get to hear awesome people who are willing to go for it, right? So it's like to hear Natasha Marchevka do her thing, and Pat Kirchner, and Bobby Maxwell, and then I'm adding Billy Joe Cones and Trish Bassani and Bev Standing, and a student of mine named Tim Campbell that nobody knows, but he's a really good voice talent. He has no following, right? He has no name, but I'm also curious to understand, how does that go over? Because when people are excited, like, Mark Scott's going to read, at Open Studio, people know who you are. People have an opinion of you. They want and are expecting to see great things, right?
Yep.
Because you're going to bring the work to a certain level. What happens when it starts to get a little more interesting, where it's like, here's a guy, never heard of him. However, Hugh's bringing him in order to show that this guy on this level, who's got all the potential and the training, he just hasn't broken out yet. What's that like in Open Studio, as opposed to, six-figure folks or people that have been doing it for 10, 15 years, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting, unique concept. And it doesn't surprise me that, you said you sold out the first few. I'm glad that you've added a few more, because I think that that's something that a lot of people would definitely be interested in. So if somebody wants to either, I guess, get the fly on the wall pass, or if, maybe somebody's interested in actually being the subject of one of these, if you decided to do it in January or carry on with it from January, where do we go to get the information on that?
That's all. I'm now connected to my site, which is conversationalvo.com.
Okay.
You go in there, and I'm pretty sure it's all built out, because I got to tell you, building a back end takes a lot more time than you think. I see that wise nod, that knowing nod of, you're going to do it well.
We make it look easy when everything works, but to get to that point, not easy.
No, not at all. Not at all. Right. So that's still in process and development, all of that. Right now, the events page is built out at sessions.conversationalvo.com/events.
Okay.
But if you just go to conversationalvo.com, you can sign up, if the spaces are available, for the Open Studio sessions. And you can also sign up for the free consultation with me as well. That's right there on the front. Then you can jump in my calendar and do, a quick 20, 30 minutes with me. Those conversations always go longer anyway, because I can talk a lot.
I mean, if you're the guy that's teaching everybody the art of conversational voiceover, it stands to reason that you would be really good at having conversations and enjoy them.
So you can go into, onto the site, and go into my consultation calendar and book your 30 minutes. It doesn't matter who you are or your experience level. If I'm not the guy to work with you, I send you to people that I know, like, and trust that
Good.
way,
I like that.
to really, meet you where you're at.
Yep.
Right. And that doesn't mean that it isn't necessarily me. We may not be a good fit to work privately. However, group coaching, that's something else. That's coming soon. That's part of the infrastructure that I'm building as well. But the open sessions right now, that's the thing that people are really appreciating. So I'm excited that the first steps towards that have been so successful.
I love it. We'll put the link to that in the show notes so that anybody can find access to that, and head to the website to learn a little bit more about you. You were taking email addresses, I know, at VO Atlanta. Have you got a newsletter or something like that? Is that on the website too?
That is going to be. I've been saying it's been coming back for a long time.
We just created accountability now because, you know, the
Oh my
show's going out,
God.
you know, 1,000 voice actors are going to listen to it.
No, it's completely true. It's completely true. The tentative title right now is the Convo VO 80/20
Okay.
because I want it to be 80% content and like, hey, I am going to announce things, but it's only going to be 20% of it because I market through education, period, end of sentence. If you check me out on LinkedIn, all my posts are, you know, about educational ideas. And then I also understand you got to put a picture of yourself up there too. So there's one of me in front of Dunkin' Donuts in my hometown, you know, and there's another one of me like on the train smiling badly and all that kind of thing. But all the posts are about, you know, specific ideas in the
Yep.
voiceover space. So yeah, I I think you educate first, and then, you know, you want to hang out, you know, and study with me, please do. But I like to lead with the ideas, not just the announcements.
Well, I would say that you have definitely educated here because I feel like I just got to have the happy privilege of sitting through a 1 hour masterclass on conversational VO. And I have no doubt that everybody that listens to this interview is going to feel the same way. And I have a feeling that if you haven't sold out some of those other open sessions, that by the time this episode drops and people have a chance to listen, there's going to be a lot of people curious and wanting to check that out. So Hugh, thank you so much for uh, being willing to be so open and give so much here in this last hour. It's been absolutely incredible.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.